Now, when Wittgenstein began to become dissatisfied himself with this philosophy of his that he'd published in the Tractatus, which way did his own dissatisfaction proceed?
I think perhaps I might say a little bit here about what Wittgenstein was doing in the interim. You spoke earlier in general terms about his career, the engineering at Manchester, the becoming interested in the nature of mathematics, the studying of Russell, the going to Cambridge to work with Russell. And at this period, he was an extremely isolated figure, perhaps locked up mainly in his own thoughts, talking to one or two people, particularly Russell. And the philosophy of the Tractatus reflects that in a way by being an immensely individualistic philosophy. There's no suggestion of language in a way being a communicative instrument. It's an instrument for reporting to oneself, for describing. There's no emphasis on it being a medium of exchange. Well, as I said, quite compatibly with the doctrines of the Tractatus, he thought he'd got all the answers, and so at that point he gave up the subject. And for a number of years in the 1920s, he was an elementary school teacher. Then he worked as a monastery gardener, helped design a house for his sister. And it wasn't until the end of the 1920s that he took the subject up again. He got into conversations with various leading figures of what was to become the Vienna Circle. And this interested him in philosophy again. I mean, one could reasonably suppose that philosophical thoughts were going through his mind in the interim, but it clearly wasn't part of his plan of life to continue thinking about philosophy after the publication of the Tractatus. Then he was stimulated into thinking about philosophy again, and of course the very different second philosophy of Wittgenstein developed from that period onward. Now, at first it seems that he was quite well disposed towards the particular interpretation that the Vienna Circle gave of his account of what the fundamental elements of language are, namely their view of them as reports of experience, not just configurated names of simple objects with no explanation of how those objects relate to our awareness. But he moved away from that, I think, reasonably soon. Remember, he returned to Cambridge in 1929 and stayed there in various capacities until getting involved in various sorts of war work. And in this period, he produces a completely different philosophy, which does not offer one clear, definite, abstract principles about the essential nature of language, but approaches language as a natural human phenomenon, something that we find going on round us, a very complicated overlapping array of human practices, like one another in some ways, different from one another in other ways. And an essential feature of this later philosophy is that language is essentially a public or social phenomenon, that it can only function if there are rules that are accepted by more than one person, so that any one person's use of the rules which guide him in speaking is open to correction and improvement by another person's observation of his practice.
I think probably the easiest way into the later philosophy of Wittgenstein and into seeing how it differs from the earlier philosophy is to start with the two different theories of meaning in the two different philosophies. We talked earlier about how the central theory of meaning in the early philosophy was that a proposition is a picture of the world, a picture of reality. This central metaphor is changed in the later philosophy. He no longer sees meaning as being a picture of the world at all, or anything like that. He sees the meaning of an utterance as consisting in the use to which it can be put. In other words, he sees a sentence as not a picture but a tool. And the meaning of this sentence is, so to speak, the sum total of its possible uses. And this, of course, as you were just saying, relates it to human activity and ultimately, indeed, to different ways of life. Now, this shift in the view of what meaning is absolutely fundamental to the whole philosophy, and a whole mass of changes from the earlier philosophy then follow from that, don't they? Can you, so to speak, take the story up from there?
Yes. What we've got here, I think, is, in a way, best expressed through the two metaphors that I think both cropped up in what you just said then. First of all, the constant reference from language to games, which is incorporated in a crucial technical term of the later philosophy, the notion of a language game.
Incidentally, can I just interrupt to say I think that this metaphor has been extremely unfortunate, because a lot of people have concluded from the fact that Wittgenstein is always talking about language games and the use of language as a game, that he somehow regarded all utterance as frivolous, And that confirms a lot of the prejudices that some people have about linguistic philosophy, that they're just playing with words.
That was certainly not his intention. It was just to draw our notice to two features of games. The first one, simply that they're rule-governed practices, and a lot follows from this in a way about how the rules of a game can change, and the games can resemble one another in all sorts of different ways. That second point leads on to the second feature about games, which is that there's no common characteristic to all games. Games, as he says, are related to one another by family resemblance. And that, applied back to language, means the various kinds of activity we perform with language, asking questions, cursing, greeting, praying, to give some examples he enumerates, these are all different things we do with language. Now, the game analogy, I agree, might seem to carry with it the suggestion that therefore these things are just for fun or pastimes or what have you. But the other analogy that you mentioned was the analogy of language to a set of tools which are used with a purpose. I mean, there's these two things about language. It's a purposive undertaking, and yet it's carried out with items which are governed by conventional and alterable rules.
Well, now, this notion of language had a lot of influence outside philosophy, didn't it? Especially in anthropology and sociology. Can you say something about how they were affected by this new notion of meaning?
Well, I think one needs to precede that by one remark about his later view of the nature of philosophy itself. There is a great continuity between his earlier and later general view about philosophy, namely that it's essentially an activity and not a theory, to use the formula of the Tractatus. It's something that you do, philosophy. It's not something you arrive at and can...
it's not a body of doctrine.
Final body of doctrine. He says that quite explicitly in the Tractatus. It remains the case in the investigations. He says one shouldn't put forward philosophical theories. They simply augment confusion. What one does as a philosopher is to assemble reminders about the way in which language is actually used in its various forms, the various distinct but not utterly unrelated games, language games in which it is employed. One assembles reminders of these to prevent people from running away with misleading analogies. The misleading analogy he had perhaps most prominently in mind was the tendency to think because we say, I felt a pain, or I have a pain is some kind of definite, identifiable inner object, private to us, which we notice within ourselves and report to other people. And a very great deal of the investigations is concerned to break the hold of that picture of how we talk about our own mental life. That is the reporting of private experiences.
That picture is precisely the sort of picture that his earlier theory of language, as put out in the Tractatus, would lead one to adopt. Do you think that there's any truth in the following, that when Wittgenstein published the Tractatus, he was, as it were, bewitched by a single theory of language, namely the picture theory, that he later came to realize that this was false, and that being bewitched by a misleading theory of language had resulted in a wholly mistaken way of doing philosophy. And therefore he came to think that before you could really do philosophy, you had to carry out an investigation of the different ways in which language can mislead us, so as not to be misled in our thinking about the world, and that this itself became a way of doing philosophy. In other words, a multiple investigation into the different ways in which false assumptions about language can mislead us in our thinking about the world. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Well, it's undoubtedly true that a great deal of the investigations takes the form of a criticism of his earlier doctrines. Certainly the first quarter of it is largely directed towards attacking the notion that words are essentially names. His view is that the use of names is one of these language games, one element in language. The teaching of names is a language game. We have to understand a great deal of language, he maintains, in order to understand the activities that someone's engaging in who's trying to tell us what the name of something is. So he wants to argue there's no absolute or fundamental priority to the notion of naming. It's just one of the things that language does. From that he goes on to attacking this idea that there are ultimately simple objects and ultimately simple propositions. He insists that simplicity is always relative to some particular investigation. And so there's this enormous sense that has developed of language as a public, available social reality, not language as some kind of essence which you can work out in your head by pure reasoning.